After the long journey of creating this character rig, we are finally ready for the last few steps before sending this character off to be animated. Mainly, we'll be focusing on set-driven keys. To start, we'll need to create custom attributes for our controllers and link them to keyed transformations. This will make animating less linear movements much simpler. We'll start with a simple example of crossing the character's eyes, then we'll move on to some more complex features like eye blinking and finger gripping. After that, we should have enough know-how to create our inverse foot roll. While we make our driven key animations, we'll take that opportunity to use the poses for some detailed skin weight touch-ups in the eyelids and hands. Once we're all done with those steps, our rig will essentially be complete, but there are still a few ways to further finalize our scene to make it a much more friendly space for the animator to work in. Essentially, set-driven keys are little animations that we use to control various objects in the scene in certain ways. So for our first example, and how we're going to get started with this, is a pretty basic example. We're going to add an attribute to this controller here that we can key during animation to control these two eye controllers. And what we're going to end up with is an attribute that when we scrub through it, it'll cross these two controllers so we get a cross-eyed effect. And that way, whenever we're animating or something, we can have the character looking at like a butterfly or something, and it can land on his nose, and we get that effect of the eyes crossing. So the first thing we need to start with is a custom attribute itself. So I'm going to start by putting the attribute on this main eye controller, because I think that'll be the most useful place to key that attribute. So I'm going to first just select this controller, and we're going to go into the channel box here. And here you can see we have the 4 default attributes in here. We have the translate, rotate, scale, and visibility. So we're going to add a new attribute in here to cross the eyes. And to do that, we want to make sure we have this controller selected. And we're going to go up into modify up here in the toolbar. And we're going to go down and look for add attributes. There's actually a whole attributes section here for editing attributes and deleting them as well. But we want to just add them to start. So we're going to click this, and that'll open up the add attribute window. And there's a bunch of different options in here, and there's even some tabs, but we're not going to get into that too much. We just want to add a basic attribute in here. So first, we're just going to go down this list here. We're going to start by adding a long name, and I'm just going to call this cross eye, and that's essentially the name that's going to appear over here in the channel box. Then I'm going to tab down, and it's going to go into the minimum value, and then below that you'll also see the maximum value. So the minimum, I'm just going to do -10, and then the maximum I'm going to do +10, and leave default at 0. And what these values become are the min and max of how far you can scrub in the channel box. So when you scrub the translate attribute, it goes into infinity, I believe. When you scroll the rotate, it goes to 360 and -360. When we scrub through our attribute, it's going to go from 0 to -10 to 10. And that's how that's going to work. All this other stuff you can leave by default. And from here, you can just click add. And you'll see cross-eye appear in this column. You can even click it and you can scrub through it, and you'll see we get -10 and +10 as we scrub through it. So that's perfect, and that's all we need for now. And at this point, we can start to add our set-driven keys to this controller into this attribute, so our attribute actually does something. So let's find the set-driven key window. You want to make sure you're in the animation toolset by clicking this drop down and going to animation. And then we want to go over on the toolbar and find key, click on that, and find set-driven key, and that'll open a flyaway window, and you want to click on set. And this will bring up our set-driven key window that we'll be working from. And in here, you'll notice there's these two windows. There's one on the top and one on the bottom. They're labeled driver and driven. So Maya's asking us for a driver and asking for what's driven. Our driver is going to be what contains our attribute, and that's going to be this main controller here. So you can have that selected. You can go down to the bottom and say load driver. So you click on that, and that'll load the driver into this panel. And now you'll see all the attributes, including our custom attribute, in this second window here. So you want to make sure you have this custom attribute selected. So I have my cross-eye selected here. Now next we have the driven, and we want to make sure that we're driving these two eyeball controllers, because these are what we want to move. So I'm going to select both of these at the same time, and I'm going to go down in the bottom here and click load driven. So now Maya knows what our driver is, and now it knows what our driven is. But we still need to tell Maya what it is exactly about these two controllers that we want to be controlling with our cross-eye attribute. So we're going to select these two controllers in here, and I'm going to find the translate X attribute here and select that. Because whenever we scrub this cross-eye attribute, we want these two controllers to move into the center. So essentially they're going to be scrolling on the x-axis. You can check just by moving them. You see that the x value is changing up here. And one thing you might notice is whenever you have a value selected on your driven assets, that the key option is now available. And as long as these two assets are in their default position, you want to hit key right away. And when you do that, you'll see over here that both of these controllers have a little blue tick next to them. And that means they're being controlled by another attribute. So these X values are now being controlled by the cross-eye attribute. So the next thing you want to do is go back into our driver and change the cross-eye value from its default position 0 to 10. And at this point, we're going to want the eyes to be fully crossed because that's what this attribute's doing. So at positive 10, we want to make sure that these controllers are moving into the center. So I'm just going to scooch this window out of the way for now. And I'm going to go into our fore view and into the front view here. That way I know when I move these controllers, they're going to be exactly in the middle. So I'm going to start with my left eye controller. I'm going to go up into the grid snap button up here and click that. Then I'm just going to translate this over until it pops into the center. And then I'll look over in the channel box and I see this is negative 3.4. I'm just going to click on this guy and just do a positive 3.4. And that way I know that these two controllers are exactly overlapping each other. So now I'm just going to go back into the perspective view and bring back my set-driven key window. And because all this information is still plugged in the right way, we still have the icon as the driver, the cross-eye as the attribute, and our two driven controllers having their X translate controlled. We can just key this, and that essentially makes an animation key at this position, where both of these controllers are in the center. So at this point, we can select our driver and go into the cross-eye attribute and scrub through that, and we'll see that we've created our little two-key animation here, because we have a key at the default position, which was at 0, and then we just finished with a key at 10. So I'm going to put this at negative 10 now, because I want to have kind of a bug eye look. And I'm going to do the same exact thing as I did for the cross eye. I'm going to scooch this window out of the way. I'm going to go back into the fore view in the front view here. I'm going to select this eye, and I'm going to go as far as I think is necessary. We'll do 9.6 here. And then the other one we'll do a negative 9.6. And that way we get a good range of bug-eyedness with our controller. Now in the viewport, you can get a sense of what this is looking like by bringing the controller closer to the character's face. And you can see if is this a good bug eye position for him to be, or is that not enough, or whatever. You can just always test that. So that looks good to me. I'm going to turn off the grid snap because I'm not using that anymore. And I'm going to bring in the set-driven key window. And with those controllers positioned that way, I can simply hit key again, and we'll key these to the negative 10 setting in our attribute to this position. So now when we grab our cross eye and we scrub through it, we see we get a full range of movement between negative 10 and 10. To where we have bug-eyed and cross-eyed. Now if you ever want to change any of these keys that we placed, you can always go to the driver, change the attribute to the value that you want, so say negative 10, and change the position of the driven and re-key it. So say these are a little too far out for my taste. I can always change this translate X value in the eye controller, and let's say I'm just going to make this negative 8, and then I'll make the other one positive 8, and I can just hit key. And now at this position, this negative 10 position, those controllers will always wind up at negative 8 and positive 8 instead of at the value that were before. So now we can scrub through this again, and we see that reflected in our animation. Another way to modify these, I'm going to set this back to 0 again, is to go into Windows up here in the toolbar, go to Animation Editors, and find the Graph Editor. And in this window, we can view and edit our set-driven key animations just like we would with any other animation. So making sure you have our eye controller selected, our driver selected, you can look over here in the left panel and see that appears there. And if you click this plus icon here, it'll drop down, you can view the contents. You should also see in this timeline viewport some lines appear. And those are actually the curves for our set-driven key animations. So if you hit the F key with your mouse hovered over this window, it'll actually focus in on these keys and you can get a better visual. So at the positive 10 here, you see that we have some keys set at 3.4. And then if you slide down to negative 10 and select those keys, you'll see that those are all set to 8 or negative 8. And then right in the middle, we have our default position, which is 0. So if you'd like to, you can easily select and change these curves through this window and see that reflected in our animation whenever we move our cross-eye attribute. But for now, I think these are fine. So I'm going to close out this window and we can move on to keying the character's eyelids with set-driven keys next.